Now, as it just so happens, I'm going to actually have to cut that story off right there. You know, there are a lot of things that there's still a lot of things I have to say about it. But you know, if I were to talk about just this one thing, I wouldn't have time to talk about anything else on this podcast. And as a matter of fact, because of the amount of time that I just spent talking about that one thing, I really only have time to talk about one more story. And so, of course, because I started with that, I have to end off with the UFC. And so for those of you who follow the UFC, who follow the podcast, you're all well aware that the last weekend, you know, the welterweight champion of the world, Kamaru Usman, defended his championship against Jorge Masvidal. And so for those of you who actually watch the sport by now, you are all aware that Kamaru Usman retained the welterweight championship of the world against Jorge Masvidal with a second-round knockout. That is not the way that anybody thought that Kamaru Usman was going to retain his championship. But as it turns out, that's exactly how he did it. And so there was a lot of talk about, as they went into this, that pretty much everybody in that fight, both men had gone all in. You know, Kamaru Usman, he bet his championship. Jorge Masvidal, he bet his stardom. And as they walked away, either one guy was going to be the star and the champion, and the other guy was going to be neither one of those two things. I'm not really convinced that that is true for Jorge Masvidal. I mean, we're going to have to see what is next for him. But it's definitely true for Kamaru Usman. I think that if you didn't think that Kamaru Usman was a star before, you know, I think that everybody does have to acknowledge that he is now. But I think that as much as the question of exactly how did Kamaru Usman manage to rebuild himself, you know, change himself, evolve out of a guy who was a wrestler and mostly winning fights by wrestling, into a guy that actually kind of looks now like he could become a hell of a knockout artist himself. You know, that's an interesting question. But the other question kind of to me centers in exactly on Jorge Masvidal, and not so much how Kamaru Usman won the fight, but how Jorge Masvidal lost the fight. So for the people who watched that fight, I'm sure that they all are well aware, like, that was a very competitive first round. If you had watched that first round, you probably would not have thought that that fight was going to end like a finish that early. And probably not one like that. You know, Jorge Masvidal, he came in, he got his fair share of shots in. Usman got in, shot, managed to take him down, keep him down for a little while, but Jorge managed to get back up to his feet, and when they got back up to their feet, Kamaru Usman actually looked like he was hurt. Like his legs looked soft, a little bit wobbly. He wasn't defending himself all of that well. And Kamaru Usman, you know, he looked vulnerable. And Jorge Masvidal seemed to know that he had on his hands a vulnerable champion. And so he was not so much trying to finish him off, but trying to finish him off in a certain way. He kept trying to go to these flying knee strikes when he probably could have put Kamaru Usman out with just some punches. Like just punches and kicks, and that's it. But no, he kind of tried to go back to what he did to Ben Askren, you know, in their famous fight. And that was how Jorge Masvidal wound up losing this. It's because he didn't go into that fight and fight the best fight that he could have fought. He went in and he tried to win that fight in a particular way that really would have been good for his ego and nothing else. You know, he wanted to win that fight, you know, in a big, spectacular knockout, and he wanted to be taunting Kamaru Usman the entire time that he was doing it. You can kind of see it where he was, you know, he was putting his hands behind his back, he was putting his hands down, he was leaning in, and he was, you know, and he was smiling, and he was staring at him, and he was taunting him. And in the final conclusion, that really wound up not looking very good on him. I have talked about this on this podcast before, but this kind of concept of you know, a fighter's scale of values. You know, I talked about it with Sugar Sean O'Malley. He wouldn't accept that defeat to Chito Vera. I talked about it a little bit with John Jones, where he just, he kind of wanted to play around and try to feed his ego rather than move on with the next stage of his career. And now I think that we have to talk about this again. Jorge Masvidal, he practically had that championship in his hands towards the end of that first round. And he wound up letting it slip away from him because he seemed to be taking this as an opportunity not to win a championship, but to feed his ego. And in the end, that wound up costing him the welterweight championship of the world. Now, he says that for him, that dream is not over. He intends to go away, train, get better, come back at some point and become the champion. It's going to be a little bit tough to figure out exactly what his path to the championship would look like at this stage, because Kamaru Usman's fought him twice, beat him twice. The first time was a 50-40 something fight. I actually can't remember the score offhand, so pardon me about that. But it was a 50-40 something fight the first time, and the second time it was a second round knockout. He's going to have to do quite a bit to try to justify trying to make this into a trilogy, because I would have to say that at the end of that trilogy, the question of who is the better fighter just isn't there. I love Jorge to death, but I think that at this point it is pretty obvious that Kamaru Usman is the better fighter. It's not even a question. We don't need a trilogy to decide that. It's not like Stipe and Cormier. It's not like McGregor and Poirier. I hope to God that I didn't just say Dustin Poirier twice in that last little bit, because that would be rather embarrassing. But I'm just not going to have the time to go back and do a whole lot of reshoots with this, so I'm just going to go ahead and shoot with it. So you would almost have to think at this point that if Jorge Masvidal is ever going to have an opportunity to become the welterweight champion of the world, it's going to have to be with another champion. Maybe Colby Covington really can beat Kamaru Usman. Maybe he really has become enough of a better fighter since the last time that he fought Usman, that maybe he could be the one to go and beat that, become that champion. But if he's going to beat Covington, he's going to have to Jorge will have to do exactly what he did not do against Kamaru Usman. He is going to have to make that decision that he values the championship more highly than he values his ego. And quite frankly, maybe at this point he has to make that decision if he is going to do anything else throughout the remainder of his career.